This is Duke University.
What most interested me about Ferguson, besides the actual events, were the response to Ferguson. And one of the things that we've witnessed over the last 3 weeks is a paradigm shift from the old civil rights model in response to these kinds of crises. Much of that shift took place in terms of social media, what we know as Black Twitter, what we understand as hashtag politics. So for those of you who are not familiar with Twitter, Twitter is a micro-blogging social media platform that allows people to communicate with other folks 140 characters at a time, meaning that it demands a certain amount of brevity. Needs to be economic. You need to get to your point. You need to be able to share information and ideas via links. One of the things that happens on Twitter is that folks can create hashtags around subjects. These hashtags become important because they allow for folks on Twitter to be able to index breaking news, emerging information and data to build community. There were over 1 million tweets using the hashtag Ferguson before CNN began any coverage of Ferguson. So what you see is that young folks are now using technology to be able to cover information on the ground that actually drives mainstream corporate media to those instances. It is why many young activists are feeling a sense of overwhelmness at this particular time, because suddenly folks are hyper aware of the violence against Black bodies and now have the ability to create communities. One of the things that's come out of this hashtag politics, and Twitter goes back to 2006, so it's roughly an 8-year-old platform, in which Black folks make up over 27% of the Twitter population. Right? Far out of percentage of the number of actual Black folks, for instance, in this country. What is created in this context is something that we now know as Black Twitter. And Black Twitter is not something that is racialized necessarily, but it's about the ideas of Blackness. The first thing that Black Twitter organized to do in the aftermath of Mike Brown's death was the organization of a hashtag that said, "If they gunned me down," in response to NBC posting a photo of Mike Brown in which he was depicted as a drug dealer. And we can remember the work that Fox News did to try to find photos of Trayvon Martin to present him in the worst possible light. And young Black folks began using this hashtag, "If they gunned me down," to post photos of their best self and the self that they are pretty sure that mainstream media would present them with if they died, and pose them right next to each other. So on the one hand, for instance, you would have a young man in his military uniform, and in another picture you would see him doing fake gang signs. It was a particularly important moment in the Ferguson reaction, because one of the things it did is that you realize these are a generation of folks who have accepted that mainstream media will never see their humanity, right? Something that was incredibly disheartening at that particular moment. But it also was a critique of mainstream media's inability to ever capture the humanity of Black folks. And the irony of this moment, the New York Times had to cover the story of "If they shoot me down." Essentially, they were forced to cover their own inability to capture the humanity of Black folks. They had to cover the critique of their journalistic practices. Shortly after that, we started to see hashtags and photos that went with it, because it's not just about Twitter, it's about using Vine, it's about using Instagram, these multifaceted social media platforms that young folks, particularly young Black folks, actually drive in terms of the innovation. So we start to see photos of people, "Don't shoot, hands up." It became something that became their Facebook profiles, on their Instagrams, on their Twitter. And of course, this goes back to what we saw in the aftermath of Trayvon Martin's murder and the hoodie marches. and a range of folks using social media. And of course, the whole point of this is that it's driving attention to what's happening. What we also saw in terms of the shift here, in terms of mainstream corporate media, was the use of those folks who are in fact embedded in social media. So that when I mentioned Jamila Lemou, who's an editor at Ebony, or Tremaine Lee, who is a contributor at MSNBC, Yamiche Alcindor, who is at USA Today, Tanzina Vega at the New York Times, Mark Lamont Hill, a working academic at both the HuffPost Live and CNN, Jelani Cobb, a working academic at both MSNBC and the New Yorker, who all took trips, in some cases against the wishes of their employers, to cover that march. Right? And of course, they brought value to this because they were embedded first in social media. And because they were embedded in social media, the folks on the ground actually had a respect to them. All of them will tell stories about how when things got crazy, regular black folks in Ferguson said, "Come into my home." Right. And it's reminiscent of the kind of things, the shift that we saw in terms of the corporate media after the Watts riots, where suddenly all of these mainstream newspapers were afraid to send their white reporters into the hood. And we suddenly saw an explosion of the number of working black journalists working for these newspapers because those were the folks that they sent into the hood. We saw young organizations like the Black Youth Project and their Black BYP 100 that immediately went on the ground in Ferguson. We saw groups like the Dream Defenders, founded by Philip Agnew, on the ground. And what's important to understand here is that this is not something that happened overnight. We can go back to Katrina in 2005, when some of these folks were 9, 10, 11 years old, and they saw mainstream media depictions of black people looting and white folks looking for food, right? That then becomes part of their own media DNA. We look at the way that they begin to organize around Gina 6 in 2007. And again, these social media platforms are still relatively new at this point in time, but these were young folks who actually went down to Gina to organize, to protest and march. Right. We think about the significance of a figure like Michael Bazin. Oh, I would have loved to have had Michael Bazin on the radio in 2014 while Ferguson was going down. And this is important. Michael Bazin is no longer on the radio. Tom Joyner ain't going to Ferguson. Young folks who, again, were politicized around the Haitian earthquake and the lack of response, and themselves committing their times and going to Haiti, not unlike what we saw in the Freedom Summer in 1964. Young college students, black, white, multiracial, going to serve. And then there was Troy Davis, death row, Georgia, 2011. And I would argue that this is where this generation realized their first victory. Troy Davis was murdered by the state, but there was a stay of execution for 3 hours. That stay of execution occurred because of the online mobilization of young folks using Twitter and social media to be able to connect to folks. The things that they learned with Troy Davis, they simply applied to Trayvon Martin in the spring of 2012. And a lot of young folks were disappointed in the aftermath of the Zimmerman trial. But the thing is, the victory was that he was ever indicted. The victory was that there was ever a trial. And the only reason why there was a trial was because of the mobilization of young folks using social media at the time. And then we get Mike Brown and Ferguson. When you think about the hashtag campaigns that black folks did, young black folks did in the hours immediately after Ferguson, it would have taken the NAACP 10 days to mobilize like that. By the time Reverend Al and Reverend Jesse showed up on the scene, they were unneeded. This was the moment when that generation said, "We are done with you." We have our own strategies. We have our own mechanisms. We have an understanding of the technology that you don't. They were very much in the spirit of Ella Baker. We're not interested in creating leaders. We're interested in providing leadership. How do we develop leadership from the folks on the ground? So now we all know about Albert French, politicians from St. Louis, who we would not know about without social media, who was on the ground taking photos on Instagram and on Vine. Who was the most important person who showed up outside of Ferguson in those immediate hours the next day or so? It wasn't Al or Jesse. It was a North Carolina rapper by the name of J. Cole, who immediately released a song responding to the trauma that folks were feeling at that particular moment. One of the lessons learned very quickly in the aftermath of all of this was that young folks said that, you can't hold folks accountable after the trial. The only way we can hold these people accountable is by actually being in the streets. The streets is what forces the media to be here. The streets is what forces this conversation. The streets is what forced our commander-in-chief to get off the golf course and offer a tepid statement of support. This weekend, a group of young black people continued this around Black Lives Matter, which importantly also included young activists and thinkers committed to the lives of LGBT folk and feminist thinkers. These young folks, this has been their freedom summer. I'm pretty sure that 30 years from now, we will write about the significant moments that have occurred in the last month in Ferguson. Thank you.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.